Okay. Well, thank you very much once again for inviting me to speak. And I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yes, all good. Great. Well, we're ready to go. And thank you very much. I hope the audience can hear me.
They're all here.
Excellent. Excellent. And I can even, yes, I can see them as well. So fantastic to see you. And wonderful to be joining you here from the UK. I'm going to be talking to you today about two books that I have recently written, published by the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. The first of these was a book called Lemon, which I published in 2019. And Lemon was a blend of neuroscience, cultural history, but also advertising research to try to understand something that Peter Field had observed, and that was a decline in creative effectiveness. Lemon was something of a diagnosis. And since writing Lemon, I've had the privilege of chatting and the pleasure of chatting to senior marketeers, but also established people in the industry who've confided in me their fear that there is a lack of confidence, also a loss of experience in advertising today when it comes to creating the kind of advertising that establishes and maintains great brands. And this at a time too, when culture, it seems to me, in this technologically disrupted world, is also in something of a bind. And so I wrote another book last year, 2021, called Look Out. And Look Out is a kind of guide, an advertising guide for a world that is being technologically disrupted. And so without further ado, let's have a look inside the covers of these books. On or about December 1910, human character changed, said Virginia Woolf. Decades of industrial expansion were changing habits of thinking. Innovations such as the aeroplane, the motor car, the film and photography of the time, X-rays, were shaping habits of thinking, changing them in much the same way that technology is shaping our world today. But it's to a period 400 years before this that we must also look to understand the changes around us in culture today. And it is to the invention of the printing press in the 1440s that we must look, and the Reformation that followed thereafter. The invention of the printing press enabled the publication of the Bible in many languages across Europe, but it also enabled the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, a kind of guidebook for spotting, identifying, and trying witches. It also enabled the publication of tales of monstrous births and wondrous signs, tales too of the apocalypse. Fake news is nothing new, folks. And these changes, these technological leaps, had a profound effect on the human psyche. Towards the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, people started to move towards the towns and cities where the work was to be found. And there was a profound feeling that the sense of community was being lost. There was also a rise in anxiety and mental illness. And Europe started to turn inwards. If we look back to 1500, the professions, particularly in the towns and cities where the books were made, published, and read, started to block themselves off in their box pews in churches to look down at their Bibles and primers. and a new sense of solemnity started to take hold. And so to anyone living in around 1500, this would have felt like the end of days. And to anyone living in around 1900, there would have been a profound sense of disorientation, of malaise. I think it's important to look at the art of these two periods to try to understand what might have been going on in the human psyche. Have a look at this painting on the left, first of all, by Albrecht Dürer. It was painted at a time when mirrors were starting to become widely available, and artists were starting to paint themselves. Leonardo painted a self-portrait at a similar time. Have a look at this painting, because in it might be deemed slightly blasphemous, in fact, because he paints himself as Christ with the beard and the curling ringlets. But it's not so much that that interests me, it's something else. It's that fixed gaze, or the stare. The stare is different from a look. The look is grounded in the body. It's voluntary. It respects its subject. It changes in its intensity. But the stare is different. The stare is fixed. It's rigid. It's analytic. It seeks to reduce its subject, to break it down, to penetrate it in some way. And the stare is also a sign of terrified helplessness too. You see it in the paintings of the avant-garde in around 1905, 1910. Have a look at this painting on the right here by Malevich, perhaps with even greater intensity than the one on the left. As I said, this was a period of rising mental illness, and the stare is also a feature of certain kinds of mental illness. So the stare, in short, is not known for its ability to build bridges with people. And when you see it, it's a sign that there is a sense of detachment in culture, a loss of human vitality, and that an adversarial stance is starting to take hold, a desire to shock and mock, and a kind of flight to fantasy often takes place too in these periods. So we see the stare emerge in around 1500, 15 to 20 years before the Reformation and everything that would follow. And we see it in the avant-garde artists 5 to 10 years before the Great War and the pandemic, and that sense of detachment that would follow in the 1920s that leads to a vulnerability really in society, opens it up to very rigid and fixed thinking and everything that can follow. Well, I'm afraid to say that I think we're seeing the stare emerge again today in art, in culture, and two, in advertising. The stare that coerces is replacing the look that caresses. A rigidity has crept into culture that is visible in the human face. It's just one of many features that have changed in advertising over the last 5, 10, 15 years. Because we too have experienced a disruption, a technological disruption to the public sphere. Have a look at these photographs by Eric Pickersgill. They look unremarkable at first until you realize that he has removed the mobile devices that these people are looking at and asked them to maintain their pose. And what you see is a kind of silhouette of humanity. People hunched, looking downward, looking inward. We've created a digital world that leaves people very goal-orientated. Algorithms have pushed us to the extremes, and we spend as much as 3 hours on average a day looking down like this, so that even when we're with people, we're not exactly there. It has narrowed our attention, and attention is something that I study in Look Out. I looked at the work of a brilliant scientist, neuroscientist, psychiatrist, and philosopher, Ian McGilchrist, to try to understand how the brain deals with our attention, in fact, the different types of attention. Ian McGilchrist is perhaps the world's foremost expert on brain lateralization. Since the 1960s, we've had this misguided idea that the left and the right hemispheres might do different things. That's not true. They're both involved in all sorts of important ways in every kind of cognitive function. But it is true to say that they do things differently. They have different takes on the world, different modes of attention. The left hemisphere has much more localized, passes information around in a very localized, compartmentalized way. The right hemisphere has much greater overlap, more branching, if you like. So it's more associative in the way that it's structured. It also has more white matter, more myelin that passes information around much more quickly. And the right brain is heavier and in fact bigger than the left hemisphere too. These differences between the hemispheres, you tend to see differences in the way that they bring attention to bear on the world, not just in people, not just in other mammals, but in birds too. And it's worth talking about birds for a moment, because that helps to make something, I think, quite clear. When you see a bird pecking around on the ground, looking for food, looking for grubs, worms, grains, that's the left hemisphere controlling the right eye of the bird, bringing a very narrow beam attention to bear on things, seeking to identify and categorize its food so it knows what to eat. Now, all the while, the right hemisphere, which controls the left eye in the bird, is bringing a kind of broad and vigilant attention to bear on its surroundings, making sure that it doesn't become someone else's lunch. And this also is true in people. The left hemisphere is very narrow in its attention, very goal-orientated. It abstracts things from their context, breaks them down into smaller parts. It likes to categorize things and people. It's very explicit in the way that it thinks. It can't bear ambiguity. It believes in very linear cause and effect. It likes things to be familiar and repeatable. It's very literal, very factual, so it can't bear the idea that, you know, two things could be true at once. The same thing could be true seen in different perspectives. So it's rather dogmatic and self-absorbed, and it has an overly optimistic sense of the world too. You see this in patients with right brain damage. It likes tools, things with which to manipulate the world. Language, signs, and symbols are chief of these. And it can't really appreciate music, only very basic rhythm. But the right hemisphere, which is the hemisphere that presents the world to us in the first place, is very broad and vigilant in its attention. It sees the whole, everything in context. If the left brain is interested in things, the right brain understands people, their gestures, their intonation, their accents, their emphasis, if you like, everything that wraps around the words. So it understands the implicit. It understands the whole world, in fact, as a set of connections and relationships. It's open to novelty and contradiction. It could well believe that two opposing thoughts could both be true at the same time, which means that it understands metaphor and that it understands humor. In fact, it's the right hemisphere that tells the difference between a joke and a lie. It's very self-aware and questioning of its time and place in the world, and it's what gives us, in fact, our sense of lived time, space, and depth. And it helps us to appreciate music, to hear the individual voices as well as the whole, everything unfolding in lived time. Now, these two hemispheres of the brain are joined in the middle by something called the corpus callosum, this bundle of fibers in the middle, in the cutaway here. Now, as well as bridging the two brains, the corpus callosum actually inhibits one brain or the other at any given time. And the left hemisphere has a greater inhibitory effect on the right than the right does on the left. And so sometimes in individuals, in some periods of history, we see this kind of swing towards left brain dominance in the way that we think and behave and the kind of attention that we bring to bear on the world. Let's talk about attention in a bit more detail. If I show you this figure, the chances are you will see it as H4 before you see the E's and the 8s. And that's because the right hemisphere that presents the world to us brings a kind of broad beam attention to bear on things. It's what is responsible for our alertness and sustained attention that ground us in the world and in the people in it. It's what helps us to be vigilant to things at the edge of our awareness, stuff that's out there, if you like. And it helps us with divided attention too. And anything of interest that the right brain spots, it passes to the left hemisphere for narrow beam attention to be brought to bear. The E's and the 8's in my example here. So we always see the wood before we see the trees. And in the last 5-10 years, I think our broad beam attention has been disappearing as we've been spending more and more time looking downward and inward. This means that there is a sense of detachment in culture, that culture loses its human vitality, and also you get this adversarial stance starting to take hold. The left hemisphere is the hemisphere to which anger lateralizes. When I was writing my last book, I went out for a walk and I walked past a woman coming the other way, walking her dog. And the dog jumped up at me and started barking viciously. She pulled on the dog with her lead and she said, "I'm so sorry about that. He's normally fine. It's the cone." The dog was wearing one of those veterinary cones round its neck, which narrow its attention. And when dogs wear those cones, they start to feel rather fearful and aggressive. And I think that's what's happened to us too in the last 5 or 10 years. Certainly, when you look at Google searches for terms like anxiety and humor, you see that there's been a rise in the number of people looking for things connected to anxiety since about 2009, 2010, about the same time that humor starts to cross over and go in the other direction. People not looking for funny things anymore. This is a concern to me because I think humor keeps society flexible. It pokes fun at rigidity. And when it starts to disappear, then it's a real problem for all of us. We see this loss of humor in the number of films that are made that are romances or comedies. This has been gradually declining in the last 20 years. And what happens when we get this loss of human vitality? Well, normally the left hemisphere tries to shock us into feeling. And we see the rise of the horror and the thriller at the same time. This is the context within which advertising, of course, is being made today. And we see in our testing at System 1, this loss of humor, this loss of amusement, if you like, in how people are responding to advertising being made today. And for anyone who's wondering why I'm so interested in these historical periods in history, I think we can see direct echoes of the art of those periods in our advertising today. The barren landscapes, the darkened skies, a sort of introspection, this frontality and symmetry as well, which is the enemy of movement. And even in this case, the horse that stares. We also see the visual language of the avant-garde with its desire to shock and this inwardness too, not to mention the abstraction. So what can be done? How can we move from the darkness to the light? How can we re-engage our broad beam attention? Well, there are things I think that each of us individually could do, but I think that advertising can play a role too, because these two types of attention, broad beam attention and narrow beam attention, have a bearing on the type of creative work that we make and the types of business effects that we can expect to see as a result. Let me tell you something else about the right hemisphere of the brain. It's much better connected to our limbic system, which helps us to experience emotion. And it's much better associated with our episodic memory. That's memory of people, places, events in our past. Whereas the left hemisphere is more associated with semantic memory, memory of facts and figures in the public domain. This gives us our first clue as to the type of attention, the type of advertising that we need to create to capture this broad beam attention. I'm going to show you an ad now, and it's an old ad, but it's an ad that I think was designed to capture this broad beam attention. I'm going to play it and then we'll talk about it.
I walked about a bit on my own. Oh no. I strolled around without anyone else. Oh dear, oh dear. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills.
Only Heineken can do this because it refreshes the poets other beers cannot reach.
The poet William Wordsworth reimagined there from the Heineken Refreshes the Parts campaign many years ago. But you'll notice there the broad views, the vistas, the mountains, the landscape, the sounds of nature, the music, the characterization in the voice, the referencing of the past, and a kind of parody on what was going on, a kind of metaphor here for the brand and the product. I'm now going to show you an ad which I think is designed for narrow beam attention. Let's have a look at it.
Introducing Budweiser Zero. 0% alcohol, 0 grams of sugar, full Budweiser flavor. A refreshing alcohol-free brew that tastes like the real thing. Budweiser Zero, zero compromise.
Did you notice how close up we were to everything there? The E's and the 8's in my example. So we have advertising here on the right, which in my view is designed to create interest in the brand and product. It assumes that there's no inherent interest in them already. And then we have advertising on the left here, which assumes an inherent interest in the brand and simply seeks to nudge people towards a purchase. A new variant, perhaps, in this case. So we have advertising on the right here for broad beam attention, which we might describe as brand building advertising. And we have advertising on the left here for narrow beam attention, which we might describe as performance or activation or direct response advertising. And it's towards this kind of advertising on the left that the prevailing advertising style has been moving in the last 10, 15 years. In Lemon, I look at the type of features that you might expect to see in relation to the left and the right hemispheres. Have a look at the advertising on the left here from recent years. You can see here a sort of flatness. You can see how close up we are to everything. If we see people, we just see their lips or their hands, or perhaps we see their face, but it's a stare looking at us, devoid of vitality. We see not things happening in live time, but time broken up into smaller parts. And we see everything has a kind of rhythmic quality, just not visually, but in the sounds of advertising today too. There's also a kind of self-consciousness and these words on the screen all the time. It's quite different from the advertising of 30 or so years ago that you can see on the left, on the right here, sorry, with its depth, a clear sense of place, a scene unfolding in live time, people connecting with each other, dialogue, sense of humor, metaphor. And it's in Lemon that I first try to understand what these features might look like in advertising and when this shift might have happened. For the left hemisphere, I look at features that we might describe as the following: flatness, abstracted product features or body parts. So just bits of things, if you like. The left brain likes to break things down into smaller parts. Words getting in the way on the screen, voiceover, monologue, this kind of me at you communication, telling you what to think and do. Adjectives used as nouns, so things like small just works, the left brain likes things. Freeze frame effects, audio repetition, rhythmic soundtracks, these might be things associated with the left hemisphere's preferences. And then I also look to features of the right hemisphere might appreciate and understand. A clear sense of place, a scene unfolding with progression, characters with agency, implicit and unspoken communication, so perhaps knowing glances between people, dialogue, distinctive accents, a play on words, or messing with language, if you like, things set in the past, reference to other cultural works, as we saw in that Wordsworth example for Heineken, music with melody too. Now you'll note that the features on the right here, of course, cost money to make compared with those on the left. And in Lemon, I look back at a long-running soap opera here in the UK called Coronation Street, and I reconstructed an ad break from week 40, a typical week, going back 30 years, and we looked for 700 or so ads, at these ads for these features, for these left and right brain features. I trained someone up, and my assistant, she coded them up blind with no knowledge of the year in which they were aired. And what we found was that in 2006, there was a massive swing away from whole-brained or even slightly right-brained advertising to advertising that was very left-brain dominant. And this happened before the Great Recession. Now, you might think, well, so what? It's just a change in advertising style, isn't it? Well, actually, no, it has a real bearing on the ability of advertising to connect with audiences, to elicit an emotional response, to orientate their attention, and to put your brand in long-term memory. At System 1, the company I work for, we measure emotional response to advertising using a scale that we've developed, a pictorial scale, on the work of Paul Ekman, the psychologist, who's shown that there are 7 basic emotions we all express in the same way in the human face, regardless of culture, race, background. And to those we add neutrality, because it could be that people don't feel anything at all towards your ad. So we show the ad and we ask people how they feel. They can select a face because the face is much more sensitive to how we're feeling rather than words. More right-brained, the right brain helps us to understand facial expressions after all. And so we know how people are feeling about an ad at the end of an ad. And from years of work comparing emotional response with advertising effectiveness, we've developed a scale, a star rating, if you like, from 1 through to 5 stars, which enables you to dial up or dial down your share of voice to give you a much better indication of your likely market share gain over a long period. So let me explain to you how that works, because it rests on the principle of extra share of voice, something that Peter Field and Les Binet have talked about. Mark Ritson talks about it too. Extra share of voice, if you have it, is a very helpful thing. Let me give you an example. If you're a brand that has 10 percentage points of market share and your share of voice is 20 percentage points, you have an extra share of voice of 10 percentage points. And this means that in the following 6 months to a year, you're likely to get a market share gain of about a 0.5 percentage point. That's what this chart is showing you here, really, how that plays out, that model in the real world. That predicted growth for 12 cereal brands here in the UK, the dots here are those brands. That predicted growth tells you what the model would expect these brands to achieve, and that actual growth at the bottom tells you what they did actually achieve. And you can see that the model, broadly speaking, holds true. But what if we have emotional response to each of these ads for each of these brands, and we know how much was spent on them, as we do at System 1? Well, if we have that and we factor that in too, so we're not just looking at the quantity of advertising, but looking at the quality of advertising too, we get a much better model, a much better explanation of real-world effectiveness. Not just quantity, it's quality of advertising that matters, and emotional response is a very good proxy for that. Now, the thing is that the more of these left brain features you have in your advertising, the less likely it is that you're going to elicit this emotional response that's going to lead to that market share gain, put things in long-term memory, get people to choose you over another brand. This flatness and abstraction doesn't pay. Whereas this depth and humanity really does. The more of these right brain features in your ad, the more likely it is you're going to elicit an emotional response and capture attention and put things into memory. So we have advertising features which are more effective, these right brain features, and advertising features which are less effective, these left brain features of building brands and growing market share. And the thing is, when you factor this in on top of the chronological pattern I've been showing you, you find that it's these most effective features that are disappearing, and these least effective features which are becoming more common. And that perhaps in part explains at least Peter Field's crisis in creativity, the ability of advertising to build brands over a long period. So what can we learn from a study of the right brain about the kind of advertising that might capture that broad beam attention? Well, in Look Out, I seek to unpack this a little bit. And it all starts with an appreciation of human uniqueness. Have a look at these drawings over 300 years old, capturing, I think, the soul of this boy. The eyes, the mouth, the way the light plays on the face. These are all things which are extreme interest to the right hemisphere of the brain. Not just the eyes and mouth, but also the hands. Look at this, the same artist's depiction of his left hand. You could sort of fill in the conversation that goes with each of these gestures. The eyes, the mouth, the hands, these are the features by which the soul of another person makes itself known to us. Human vitality, human uniqueness. And when you get two people together, you get something else emerging too, something that I describe as human betweenness. Have a look at this Vermeer painting on the left, the way the light catches the girl's face, the kind of relationship that is implied by this painting. Her left hand controlled by the exploratory right hemisphere on the table, showing a sort of complicitness in something that's happening, an openness. The right hand's controlled by the left hemisphere, the grasping left hemisphere tucked away. We don't know what's going on here quite, but that is what makes it more interesting. In fact, great brand building advertising leaves a trail of clues, much as this painting does here, and often has a kind of story appeal, just as this painting does too. I'm going to show you an ad now which builds on some of the things I've been telling you, which draws on the human face, the hands, connection between people. I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to talk about it afterwards.
We've only just begun to live. White lace and promises, a kiss for luck and we're on our way. We've only just begun before the rising sun. We fly, so many roads to choose. We start out walking and learn to run. And yes, we've just begun. We've only just lived. We've only just begun.
Highly successful ad for the Crocker Bank in 1970. You have noticed there the features of the face and the hands, the blinking eyes, much like the painting on the left. It's also had that wonderful soundtrack, which was actually written for that ad by Paul Williams, commissioned by Hal Riney, later popularized by the Carpenters. So we've talked a little bit about human uniqueness and human betweenness and the glances that you can see in some of these spots. But I'm going to show you now talk about human movement, because this too is important. Human movement captures our attention, but it also tells us that something of significance is about to happen. Have a look at this marble statue on the left here by Bernini. Look at the way that the muscles are taut. Look at the face, the way that he's about to cast his sling. Well, I'm going to show you now an ad which I think has something in common with this. Let's have a look at it and have half an eye on the statue on the left as you're watching it.
Morning, all. Morning. Brothers, sisters, today a great legacy rests upon your shoulders. Because here, we make more than just tea. We make proper brews. Brews that bring a tear to your eye and warmth to your soul. So go out there and do it for each other. Do it for yourselves, but most of all, do it for Yorkshire! Oh, and the fire drill's Thursday at 3.
Yorkshire tea, where everything's done proper.
Yorkshire tea, where everything's done proper. You'll notice there the drawing of the pointer, like the sword, Sean Bean playing a part that he's very well known for. And the use of humour, the facial expressions, the reaction shots, all of that is very involving. So human movement's important, but let's talk about something else now. If you've got your character, your betweenness, your movement, there's something else that has to happen, an incident of some kind. Have a look at this painting by Rembrandt on the left here, which also has story appeal, if you like. Look, what's happening here is that God is telling Rembrandt off. He's reproaching him for using the gold from the temple. You can see him writing in the sky here behind. Look at the shock in the faces around. Well, I'm going to show you an ad now, which I think does a similar thing. It has character, it has incident, so something happens, and it has a very clear place as well. Let's have a look.
Hold tight. Text meant for Danny. Sent to Daddy. Relax. I'm your Tanguru. Just blame it on autocorrect.
I meant quiche. I fancy quiche. Like aubergine. We should have an aubergine quiche for dinner tonight. I love quiche.
Time to tango.
I love it.
So Amelia finds herself in a difficult spot, and there is a divine intervention, what I call a fluent device. Both Amelia and the Tanguru here are used repeatedly through a campaign, characters that are used again and again. But something is happening here, and you see in the reaction of Amelia's face, and indeed the woman depicted in Rembrandt's painting on the left here, something of that incident in the people involved. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the fluent device, because in Lemon I talk about the importance of this recurring character, either a character that comes back again and again, like in the example I've just shown you, or a scenario expressed as a slogan, a human scenario, like that Yorkshire tea ad I showed you a couple of minutes ago, which was about, in Yorkshire we do things proper, or properly, the Yorkshire way of saying properly perhaps. These fluent devices are extremely helpful in generating market share gain and profit gain, as I show with my work with Peter Field and the IPA's database. And these fluent devices are a kind of distinctive asset. We talk a lot about distinctive assets today, logos, shapes, fonts, colors, but these things don't live. They're static. They're things, if you like, of the left hemisphere. When it comes to audio-visual advertising, we need to create the living, things that move, that interact with their surroundings and with each other. Because these things not only elicit an emotional response, but they capture attention too, as I show in my work in Lookout, which focuses on attention, in fact. In Lookout, I extend the features that I looked at in Lemon and add to these for the left brain for exploration, this facial frontality, self-consciousness, an empty smile, a focus on things, this product centricity, and split screen effects. And for the right hemisphere, I look at that spontaneous change in facial expression. We've seen some good examples in the last few minutes. Something emerging out of the scene that's not ordinary, something extraordinary. Animals, animated characters, people touching. We've seen examples of all of these things in the last few minutes. And I worked with T-Vision, the television attention monitoring company in the US. And we looked at 200 ads that they'd monitored for attention as they played out in people's living rooms in the real world. And we looked at the emotional response that those ads achieved through System 1's testing. And we looked at the features of those ads as well and found that it was advertising with these right brain features, top right here, that was much better associated with an emotional response and, of course, attention too. These things go hand in hand. So animals, characters with vitality and an implicit and unspoken communication, dialogue, people reacting to things, people perhaps touching, music with discernible melody that we can hear, something emerging from the scene that's out of the ordinary, a real sense of place as well and progression in lived time. And these features associated with the left hemisphere cause people to look away, to detach. So we have advertising on the top right here that attracts and holds attention and that elicits an emotional response, put things into long-term memory, and advertising that causes people to look away, bottom left. So you might think that these features also have a bearing on advertising effectiveness and the kinds of business effect that you can achieve, and you'd be right too. Working with Peter Field, I looked at the IPA's effectiveness database for the last 4 or 5 years, and we looked at the features of these campaigns. And we found that it was the most right brain campaigns, top 20% here on the chart, which achieved these very large business effects of market share gain, profit gain, sales gain, and that these left brain campaigns just couldn't really achieve that same level of effectiveness. This is because these right brain campaigns are much better able to create salience for your brand, to make your brand the brand in the category, to make it jump to mind first, from salire, the Latin for to leap to mind. And these right brain campaigns are much more likely to establish trust and brand esteem, which are becoming increasingly important in effectiveness terms on the IPA's database. So when we step back and we think, well, what kind of advertising do we want to create today in this digitally disrupted post-pandemic world? I think something becomes quite clear, because as brands move online and as brands set up, companies set up as online businesses, they lose their physical availability, which means they lose their mental availability too, which means one kind of advertising becomes more important, not less, and that's brand building advertising. If you're an online business, you need to spend more on brand building advertising, not less, as Les and Peter show here in these figures. If you're a subscription business, you need to spend more on your brand building advertising, not less. If you are in a category with high levels of research, you need to spend more on your brand building advertising, not less. So people type in your name into Google rather than a generic search. And if you're in a category with high levels of growth, you need to spend more on your brand building advertising, not less. So brand building campaigns will become more important, not less, in this digitally disrupted world. And that means advertising of a particular type. Advertising with an appreciation of human uniqueness, human betweenness, human movement. Advertising with character, with incident and place. Advertising with humor, music, and with an appreciation of warmth and vividness of color. Advertising a bit like the ad I'm about to show you. Paul Feldwick, the great advertising mind and philosopher, says that advertising is a bit like putting on a show. Well, in this ad, and it's an old ad again, I'd like you to have that in mind. I'd like you to look at the eyes of the characters in this show, the way that they command the stage, the way that the eyes connect the players on the stage of this show, and how all of that in turn invites us, the viewer, into the action. Let's have a look.
You knew
This was advertising that truly looked out, that sold an awful lot of jeans, sold a lot of music, and a lot of boxer shorts too. So we might conclude that the focused attention of the brain's left hemisphere perhaps oughtn't be your focus of attention as a marketeer. We need instead to broaden our attention, to look up and to look out. Because people look away from advertising that looks inwards. We need instead to create a spectacle that lifts the eyes, opens the minds, and warms the hearts of those we wish to persuade. How do we do that? Well, there are one or two ideas in these two books. And now is the time to do it, because now more than ever, we need advertising with wit and charm, advertising with human vitality, advertising that entertains. And in a world full of fear, anxiety, and detachment, what could be more wonderful than that? Thank you very much. Thank you. Perhaps, I don't know if we have time, but perhaps there might be one or two questions.
Yes, let me take you again to another place. Fantastic presentation, Orlando. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
At least it makes us think about the situation. We will now have an opportunity to get some questions from the audience. Alguém quer colocar alguma questão? I think it's everybody's very shining. So I will start by a question. It seems that attention is really decreasing. Is there any ideas on that?
I think it's fragmenting. So we're bringing a different kind of attention to bear on our surroundings today. We're losing this broad beam attention, which is what helps us with sustained attention. And sustained attention is very important for, of course, getting anything done. And it grounds us in the world and the people around us. And our attention is sort of becoming narrower and closer up, and and also quicker, shorter. You know, the left hemisphere is quite impetuous. It's not very good at you know, sort of it jumps to quick conclusions. So we need to broaden our attention. And of course, this digital world has enabled us to do all sorts of wonderful things, but it's also kind of led to this narrowing. And it has created you know, in advertising terms, advertising that can easily be broken up into smaller parts so that we put it on different channels, different platforms. Advertising that creates a kind of, enables a kind of global ad, which is supposed to work everywhere, but doesn't work anywhere particularly well. And so, you know, we've got a kind of advertising now that's in short, sharp cuts with lots of words on the screen. And gradually, we're sort of moving away from, or have been moving away from, the kind of advertising that really puts things into long-term memory, that builds brands, that means that your brand comes to mind first. And so I think this shift in attention, the shift in the media landscape, of course, as well, is contributing to this problem, the problem that Peter Field has identified. So yes, I think there is this shift in attention is also, by the way, I think behind some of the cultural problems that we're seeing today, the kind of divided countries, divided in all things. And this, you know, sort of, I guess this sort of, this malaise that we too are experiencing, just as they did in about 1900, just as they did in about 1500 too.
Do you think it's possible in the actual environment to have new advertisements like we have in the like we have before? Well, now that you are very oriented to performance.
Yes, I think we must try. In fact, there are lots of brands and companies coming to me and saying, can you tell us more about brand building advertising, because we need it. You know, you can only get so far with performance advertising. You know, once you get to a certain size, you have to really think about scale and how you put your brand in the memory of as many people as possible. So it comes to mind first. You know, you can't get famous in private, as I think Bob Hoffman puts it. You know, you need advertising with reach, and that generates these associations, these feelings, you know, across a broad population. So it is possible, and it is necessary as well. And you know, I would say that, you know, if you're looking at a script, if you're looking at an early stage idea, then ask yourself, can it be described by answering these three questions? Who's involved? What happens? And where is it set? And if you can describe your ad in those terms, then you might be onto something. It might be something that, you know, will capture attention and elicit an emotional response. So in other words, does it have character, incident, and place? And you know, there are of course advertisers doing this still, and there are some good examples, some of which I've shown today, but there are other examples too. It's not that this has completely disappeared, but there is a general trend away from this towards a more transactional, linear kind of style of advertising, which, you know, if you're not interested in the market for a new sofa, that kind of advertising is not going to put your brand on the map. People will just look away or bounce off.
All right. Alguém quer colocar alguma questão? It seems everybody was are happy what you've said, and I think they will think about. We all think about this.
Well, fantastic.
In the future.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for having me to speak.
Thank you.
If you have any further questions, just please do get in touch.
Okay. Thank you very much, Orlando.
Thank you,
Fantastic.
for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.